We've been joined to discuss all of that by the Conservative MP Kit Malthouse and by James McGrory, who runs Open Britain, which is campaigning for the UK to stay in the single market. Welcome to both of you. Kit Malthouse, so the CBI has called for us to stay in the single market and the customs union until a deal has been done. Do you agree?
I don't. I mean, I do think there needs to be some kind of implementation phase that we reach when negotiations are done. But saying now that we'll stay in both before there's a free trade agreement just means that the EU has an incentive not to agree a free trade agreement, because they get us within the structure but without any control over the rules. So no, I'm not sure it's necessarily true. And it doesn't surprise me. I mean, the CBI represents large businesses generally, and it doesn't surprise me that they would want to cling on to this kind of corporatist racket that has suited them for so long. Small business, I think, would have a much more different view.
Right. Is that how you regard the CBI, that their voice is clinging to a corporatist racket?
Yeah, I mean, the EU is, generally accepted to be, maybe not by James, but generally accepted to be a bit of a corporatist racket. It favours enormous businesses who are not as agile, not as, forward-facing, not as globally facing, and they like the protectionist approach of the EU. So it doesn't surprise me that they want to hang on to it. But I do agree that this notion that there should be some kind of cliff edge, that there's a sudden transition, might not be entirely helpful, and having a transition phase might not be a bad thing.
Right. I mean, it's no surprise to some extent the CBI saying this, but from a negotiating position, you wouldn't want to state here and now, would you, James McGrory, as a government, that would be your position throughout a transitional phase? Because, quite rightly, as Kit Malthouse said, then you've played all your cards.
Well, I think it falls into the same category as this no deal is better than a bad deal mantra. There are negotiations, there's going to have to be compromise on both sides, but this posturing that's only going to leave us being worse off seems to me to be pointless. Surely the best thing we want to do is get a deal that's good for business. And in response to this being a corporatist racket, the CBI, I mean, I fundamentally disagree with that. But this move's also been backed by the Trade Union Congress today. So it's been backed by both employers and employees as a sensible way forward. And I don't think the government are being upfront with people about the trade-offs that are going to happen if we leave the single market in the customs.
Right, we'll come to the trade-offs in a moment. You say it is all posturing, but by declaring so early on, if you like, it's sending out a message, isn't it, to the EU? And also, for many people who want to see Brexit happen sooner rather than later, there is a possibility we'll just never leave.
In fact, we're doing the opposite, though, aren't we? We are saying that whatever happens in these negotiations, no matter how they go, no matter whether we've got an agreement, no matter whether a free trade agreement is agreed, and I haven't found a single person who thinks it will be done by March 2019 in its entirety, we are instead imposing our own red line, saying we'll definitely be out of the single market, we'll definitely be out of the customs union, we'll have full control over immigration.
But your red line is to stay in the single market, isn't it? I mean, you can see why your position, which is absolutely stated and perfectly clear, will lead people to believe, a bit like the song in Hotel California, you never do leave.
Well, you can leave the EU and be in the single market.
Can you?
Well, Norway, for example, they are not in the EU, they are in the single market. My point would be the government have actually promised people frictionless trade, a deal with the exact same benefits.
All right.
I'm saying that's not possible unless you stay in the single market.
And it's not just James McGrory saying it's not possible, so does Michel Barnier, and he should know, shouldn't he? He's the chief negotiator for the EU. And is it realistic in your mind to say that we will have completed a free trade agreement with the EU by March 2019?
Yes, I think it is eminently realistic, because we're starting from a completely different position than most people are who are negotiating free trade agreements, right? So at the moment, there are no barriers. In most free trade agreements, you have to have long negotiations about the barriers that exist that you then remove. In this negotiation, it's just about the barriers that the EU decides they want to put up. And that means that things should be a lot easier and a lot quicker. Okay. And not least also, don't forget, because it's very, very much in their financial interest to have a free trade agreement with us. They sell a lot more to us than we sell to them. That's why, me as a Brexiteer, I think we should be concentrating a lot more on the rest of the world as well. But nevertheless, it would be in their rational, rational interest to want a free trade agreement. And you have to rely on the fact that, despite the fact that a lot of the negotiators are unelected, the elected leaders of the EU will want a free trade agreement because it's in their best interest.
Who else believes that we can do a free trade agreement by March 2019, apart from the government and Brexiteers?
Well, obviously the government and Brexiteers do. The opponents don't. I mean...
No, but I mean, if we're talking about businesses, if we're talking about groups of people and organisations who are in favour of Britain leaving the EU, who else believes that we can realistically do it in that time frame?
Well, I can't specifically pick somebody out for you, but if you look, for instance, at the work that the Legatum Institute did, they assembled a series of trade negotiators from across the world, all different nations. They universally said that it was eminently possible for the UK to do that.
Right, and actually, Michel Barnier is going to say that frictionless trade is not possible. That's his negotiating position. We shouldn't fall for the line from the European Union. Britain will negotiate from its own standpoint.
Of course, Britain will negotiate from its own standpoint. I'll be the first to put my hand up and say I was wrong if we do get a free trade agreement that has frictionless trade and the exact same benefits that we get from single market membership and customs union membership.
But you don't want it, so of course you would say that too. I mean, in a way, you want us to stay in the single market, and for many people that would mean that we hadn't left the EU. You'd like us to still remain under the European Court of Justice, rightly or wrongly. So, yes, you would stand in that position and say it's not possible because you want to try and persuade people away.
Well, I think the onus then should be on the people who are saying it is possible to prove it. You can prove what's possible with the single market. We're in it right now. We see the trading benefits. You can quantify them. But I think just going around saying we can have the exact same benefits isn't the same as actually tangibly proving them. I don't think business agrees with it, and I don't think anyone other than a relatively hardcore group of Brexiteers does either.
But business is valuable to them. Our business is valuable to the EU, isn't it? When you look at the trade deficit figures, they need us just as much, to some extent, or more than we need them.
I'm not saying that a deal isn't possible. I think a deal is possible. But is a deal possible on two fronts? Is it possible by actually October 2018, which is when you need to do it before you go through the ratification process? And is it as good a deal as we've got now? Is it as good a deal as single market membership and customs union membership? I don't think it will be.
Well, let's talk about the frictionless trade. You say it's actually a case of putting up tariffs rather than removing them. But if tariffs did become imposed on certain goods, are you saying we wouldn't be in a position where things would be held up at ports, where at the moment, of course, while we're part of the single market and the customs union, goods travel freely, as do people, of course, but goods travel freely across the borders, across the channel, and we know, hearing Airbus yesterday, saying that they could be held up at ports. We don't have the infrastructure to deal with that. That could cause chaos.
No, I don't think that's necessarily true. I mean, we had the guy at the Inland Revenue who's dealing with all of this stuff in front of the Treasury Select Committee before the election, and he completely refuted that. We said, won't you need more space at Dover to store stuff? Won't you need, more space? He said, no, absolutely not, because most of it is now electronically done. It's done in advance. 95% of stuff goes through completely frictionlessly. Even from outside the EU, this stuff passes through, and he thinks the systems can cope with it pretty well, as they do already, as I say, with trade from outside the EU. So he didn't seem to think there was going to be a problem, and I don't see why there would be.
How much pressure is there, Paul Waugh, on David Davis, who obviously is in charge of the Brexit department, and on Liam Fox, who is trying to put in place these free trade deals, though he can't do them at the moment while we're negotiating that position, to try and say to people like James McGrory, the trade-off will be an advantage to Britain?
Well, this is all about how practical and pragmatic you can be in delivering Brexit, and that's what David Davis's main task is, just as a Prime Minister's is. And what you've seen here from these two gentlemen is a variation on whether or not it's practical or completely impractical. As far as DD's concerned, he's actually more pragmatic than most people would expect. And I think that's why he's very popular amongst Tory members, he's popular amongst business, and today he's trying to prove that. He's trying to work through the problem. I mean, someone in government described it to me as being like 3D chess, and you need, the brain the size of a planet to work out all these problems. And it is a problem-solving issue. But the most important thing from the Tory government's point of view is delivering, making sure that all those people who voted leave actually get what they voted for.
And actually, when we talk about cliff edges, just to use the jargon, whether there would be one or not is debatable. And if there were a situation where Britain did come out on World Trade Organisation rules, the EU has to operate by those rules. They cannot maliciously take action that would harm Britain. So what's the problem?
Well, look, I agree with Barnier here. He was honest enough, I think, to say yesterday it would be the worst of an already lose-lose situation. But the worst off would be Britain. This no deal is better than a bad deal mantra, I think, is one of the most dangerous things that can be done to our country. It's the equivalent of in a negotiation saying, either you do this or I will shoot myself in the head and you in the foot.
Right.
It's no good for anyone.
Is that what you're doing? I mean, is that the worst situation ever? Has that gone now? No deal is better than a bad deal. But has it gone?
No, a huge amount of our trade is done on WTO rules across the world.
So it is still
second biggest market is the United States. You have to, in any negotiation, go out into it on the basis that you would, you're not going to take a penal deal over no deal. If no deal is better than a penal deal, then of course you'd take it. I mean, I think we need to be clear about what's happening at the moment in this negotiation, right? So there's a lot of rhetoric from Barnier and Verhofstadt and all the rest of it, and some rhetoric from our side too, pro and Remain.
Well, cabinet ministers apparently have been reported to be saying that Liam Fox is struggling to find any way to balance out losses in UK-EU
What's
trade.
happening is that the negotiating sides are trying to find the moving parts in each other's positions, right? And the deal itself won't start to become clear probably for another year or so. And then once those...
will have to become clear in a year or so, won't it?
It will, but the point is these things always get done at the end, right?
Yes.
They always get done in the last couple of months.
Nothing is agreed until everything is agreed.
Until everything's agreed. So the point is, at the moment, they're just sounding each other out. So while we can sit here and fume and fulminate, and it perhaps makes good TV for you, the truth is we won't actually know what the real position is for another few months yet.
All right. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Now, the Palace of